Us. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carol David. I'm the Executive Director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and welcome to our Prairie Happy Hour, Wildflowers and More. I'm just going to wait just a few seconds here until a few more people get logged on, and then we will begin with introductions. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carol David. I'm the Executive Director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and thanks for joining us for our Wildflowers and More Prairie Tour Happy Hour, tours of the Ray Letsinger and Schuette Prairies with Missouri Prairie Foundation Vice President of Science and Management, Bruce Schuette, and Missouri Prairie Foundation Director of Prairie Management, Jerod Huebner. I'd like to introduce them both, and then they will give their program. Bruce, as I mentioned, serves on the Missouri Prairie Foundation Board of Directors as Vice President of Science and Management. He retired from the Missouri Department of Natural Resources several years ago. He enjoyed a 36-year career as park naturalist at Quiver River State Park, north of St. Louis. And he was involved there in natural resource management, including prescribed burns, exotic species control, and ecosystem management, and also natural resource inventory, collections, monitoring, working with researchers, and nature education. And he does a tremendous amount of similar work as he did in his career for the Missouri Prairie Foundation, but as a volunteer. We're very grateful to him. The Missouri Prairie Foundation's Director of Prairie Management, Jerod Huebner, oversees prairie management for the Missouri Prairie Foundation. He plans and carries out invasive species control, prescribed fire, and all other aspects of the stewardship of the Missouri Prairie Foundation's prairies, which now total more than 4,100 acres in 29 tracts of land. Jerod also has established hundreds of acres of prairie reconstructions and administers prairie stewardship grants and participates in prairie outreach and education. And prior to working for the Missouri Prairie Foundation, Jerod worked at the Missouri Department of Conservation's Prairie Fort Conservation Area in Callaway County on a variety of prairie reconstruction activities, and as a wildlife biologist at the August A. Bush Memorial Conservation Area in St. Charles. And so with that, if you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature, and I may be posting some resources for you in the chat. Please take it away, Bruce.
Well, thank you, Carol. Yeah, 2021 is proving to be a real year for prairie dedications for the Missouri Prairie Foundation. We've got still one coming up Friday evening, actually, as part of the annual dinner, virtual one, and then one in October. But we've already done two prairie dedications this year. One in late May, and then the other in late July. So for our happy hour tour today, we're going to kind of look at what these two remnant prairies look like, basically what's growing there, kind of during the time period between these two dedications, so roughly June and July, and take a look at what you find if you were on one of the dedications or if you've had a chance to visit the prairie sort of during that time period. And so we'll start out with Schuette Prairie that was in late May. And first of all, I'd like to very humbly thank whoever was the anonymous donor who donated funding for this prairie to name it after me. That is such an honor, and I just really appreciate it. So we did this dedication on May 23rd, which did happen by chance to be on World Turtle Day. So we're hoping that one of our ornate box turtles was, or more than one, was able to enjoy the prairie dedication and has been enjoying this prairie too. And then in late July, We did a prairie dedication for the Ray Letsinger Prairie, and Ray's sister Joanne purchased the naming rights after Ray's passing, but to honor Ray. And Ray himself was had become quite an expert in the Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths of Southwest Missouri, especially with moths, but he worked with all Lepidoptera. And so it was kind of fitting, I guess, that a number of leps, these nice butterflies, showed up for the dedication. During the dedication itself, we hiked around a trail you can see mowed through the prairie that Jerod had fixed up for us. And besides the people coming to dedicate the prairie, we had some other attendants also. And so hopefully they're still enjoying the prairie out there. And at the dedication itself, we actually added several species to the known list of what we have on this prairie. Since it's a new prairie, we're still expanding out the list. So just on this, on a dedication hike we took, we actually added rough blazing star and purple prairie clover to the overall list. And I do want to just quickly mention, you may have noticed the numbers that I've got with the pictures of the flowers. Rough blazing star was a 6 and purple prairie clover is an 8. And these are what are called coefficients of conservatism. And if you're not familiar with that, and many of you might be from other talks, but if you're not familiar with it, Doug Ladd, a prominent Missouri botanist and ecologist, and then additionally Doug with Justin Thomas, several years ago had come up with a system to rate what's called the ecological conservatism value of all of our native plants. Another way to look at this is like how remnant dependent they are. So how dependent are these plants on having the original remnant habitat to grow in? And so each of the plants are ranked with a number from 0 to 10. And so as you go up in the scale, you come to plants that are more dependent on remnant habitats. And so this is very closely tied in with their conservation significance, because if our goal is to protect all the native biodiversity, protecting those plants that are most dependent on the actual remnant habitats is going to really be the key, because if we don't protect these remnants, we will definitely be losing this important part of our biodiversity. So as we go through, you'll just notice each of us has a number by it, and that's its coefficient of conservatism. And as you'll be able to tell, most of them are pretty high numbers. So we start out with one of the special plants at the Ray Letsinger Prairie. It's a plant called Barbers Buttons. It's a state listed species of conservation concern in Missouri, only found in the southwestern corner of the state. The first year we had the prairie, we could only find 1 or 2 of them on the prairie. Jerod got part of it burnt this year, and in the part that was burnt, there were literally thousands of Barbers Buttons. On the left, you can see kind of mixed in with some Indian paintbrush, and on the right, just all the Barbers Buttons that showed up on this prairie. So quite significant for protection of this rare species in our state. Now, a number of other kind of typical prairie species we've had in flower there during the last couple months that we, of these 2 prairies, only find on this one, are ones like rosinweed. We have the green-flowered milkweed or spider milkweed. This is a very low-growing milkweed, large flowers, but the plant itself is low-growing. There's white wild indigo. We found some buffalo clover. So this is actually one of just a couple native clovers in Missouri. We have the really gorgeous dwarf spiderwort. And this is another one that's kind of limited to this general portion of the state. And then there's fringe poppy mallow, or sometimes very appropriately called wine cup. Now, as we start looking at kind of all of the plants or the plants that we find at both these prairies, a lot of the typical prairie plants are found at both of them. And we've gotten some really nice displays of the prairie wildflowers this year. And so when we tend to have the big showy displays, the ones that you can see from the road or the highway when you're driving by, there tends to be several species that kind of fall in this category. These are the big ones. They'll oftentimes grow in pretty dense stands. And so these are the really showy ones that really stand out kind of from a distance. And so on both of these prairies, you can find things like pale purple coneflowers, a plant that also had many medicinal uses in the past. There is prairie blazing star. And oftentimes where you find prairie blazing star, it seems you also find rattlesnake master. Not always, but oftentimes these two species seem to be kind of associated with each other. And the rattlesnake master is in its own right a very interesting plant, kind of an unusual looking member of the carrot family with these really dense, kind of spiky looking flower heads. It's also a plant that's really good for pollinating insects and has been used in the past by people either medicinally or even making cordage. Among the showy plants during the summer are ones like downy or ashy sunflower, and they can grow in pretty large masses and can just turn whole parts of the prairie bright yellow when they're at their peak. And then there's the big flowered Coreopsis, another very abundant bright yellow member of the sunflower family found commonly in the prairies. And then also gray-headed coneflower. And then sometimes ones that are not always there in great numbers, but their colors just stand out so much. They typically really stand out in the prairies. And of course, the bright orange butterfly weed really stands out well. But besides these plants that kind of tend to dominate, that when you drive by and you just see purple or yellow out in the prairie, it tends to be those. But we have a great number of very interesting wildflowers and oftentimes very beautiful ones that aren't as conspicuous. So normally you're going to have to actually get out in the prairie and around to find these. These won't be the big masses, but when you get out, it's well worth it for what of these you can find. Like in this case, the prairie larkspur, or also called Carolina larkspur. There's a false dragonhead or obedient plant. The Carolina rose, or sometimes called a pasture rose, a really beautiful flower, but they're only a few inches tall. And so you have to kind of look for them out among the prairie grasses to find them. There's the tube beard tongue or trumpet beard tongue. And prairie parsley is another interesting member of the carrot family that is a really good one, but with its not necessarily showy colors, it oftentimes doesn't really stand out, and you have to look pretty close to find it. Again, one that stands out by its color, but is very low to the ground, is the sensitive briar. And with the wicked thorns on its stem, even such a beautiful flower is one you want to really watch for as you're walking through the prairie. And you can see those thorns on the stem account for it also being called the cat claw sensitive briar, or sometimes it was called devil's shoestrings. You can imagine how that could kind of rip you up if you're walking through the prairie unprotected. And among the many lagoons are things like goat's rue. Lead plant is one of the real classic prairie flowers. The flowers are really quite interesting, that deep purple with the bright yellow tips on the stamens. However, you have to kind of get out in the prairie to see it because they're just kind of mixed in. And because of their deep roots, they were sometimes known as prairie shoestring. There's a couple kinds of prairie clovers. purple prairie clover on the left and the white prairie clover on the right. Both, if they don't have their flowers on, they're very similar. And the only way it can tell them apart is kind of by the thickness of the divisions of their leaves. But when they're in flower, of course, they're very distinctive. New Jersey tea and a very close relative, red root, are also in both the prairies. And New Jersey tea was used a lot medicinally in the past. It was also used for tea, how it's got its name, but it was a plant that was used quite extensively in historic times for tea. And then always a good one to find, even though, again, you have to kind of look very close to find it because they're not really big out in the prairie, but this one is the American Blue Hearts. And it's, when you're kind of evaluating a prairie, it's always a good one to find. Now, we'll for a few minutes kind of move back to Schuette Prairie for the last few. And we'll take a look at some of them from here that we don't find at our other prairie that we're talking about today. This is another one of the blazing stars, scaly blazing star. But where the other blazing stars oftentimes are standing up pretty tall, this is a very low growing one, usually only a foot or two high. So you usually have to kind of look pretty close to see this one out in the thicker vegetation. This one you don't have to look close to find. This is compass plant, and compass plant is one of the tallest of our prairie wildflowers, also one of the really characteristic ones. And even when it doesn't have those big yellow sunflower-like flowers on it, the shape of the leaf on the left is very distinctive, that big webbed leaf, which they say it's supposed to kind of run in a north-south direction, hence the name compass plant. But I'm not sure if that always holds. It kind of seems like the leaves are sort of all over the place, but that's the way it's supposed to be. And then there's this little one, a very tiny little one called pink milkwart. But again, another really good one to find. And there's a couple kinds of wild hyacinths. There's a more common wild hyacinth that is found very abundantly in prairies and some other habitats a little bit earlier in the spring, but late spring and early summer is when this one, a prairie wild hyacinth, comes out. And this one is much more remnant dependent on our tallgrass prairies. And then we come to an orchid. This one, as you can imagine, can be very hard to find with the whole plant being green, the stem, leaves, and this flower. But when you see them, and they are pretty tiny, you could cover this flower probably with a quarter. But when you see it and get up close, to me, the flowers are just kind of magnificent. So this is the ragged or the ragged fringed orchid. Then we also have Culver's root, a plant that's found on some of the prairies that have this dense spike of attractive little white sort of tubular flowers. And then one of the milkweeds, it's a little more restricted to our remnant prairies. This is the green milkweed. Now, one of the things that makes this prairie kind of unique is the fact that it is a limestone or dolomite prairie. And limestone or dolomite prairies are pretty uncommon in Missouri. And so because of that, you do get an influence to these prairies that you find a number of things that are more typically found on dolomite glades. And so you might typically think of them as more glade plants, but if it's a limestone or dolomite prairie, you can find them there also. This is American feverfew. Again, a plant that was used extensively for medicinal uses at times in the past. So besides being called, well, even feverfew kind of gives you an idea. And another name for this plant is wild quinine. So that would lead you to kind of suspect that it could have been a very important medicinal plant. but this particular one has a much hairier stem than the normal American feverfew. And so this is a variety that, again, is kind of linked more to glades. And so a few of the other things that give this prairie sort of a glade-like feel is this big yellow Missouri evening primrose. A big, beautiful flower on a very tiny, almost miniature plant. So this one is, again, typically a glade one that you don't otherwise normally expect to find in most prairies, but where there is enough of a limestone influence, some of these can persist. We also have this one, Prairie Turnip, which apparently was used a lot by Native Americans for food and has a number of other common names, oftentimes revealing of its uses as food. And then a couple other characteristic plants that are usually associated with glades are on the right. There's prairie dock. It wasn't quite in flower yet, but it has a very tall stem, maybe even taller than the compass plant, but the stem is basically leafless. But on right at ground level, you see these very large, very rough sandpapery leaves. So the plant is very distinctive even when it's not in flower. And then all across that picture, you can see a smaller yellow flower. That's a Missouri coneflower. And again, the Missouri coneflower is very common on glades. So it's very highly associated on glades, but it does occur on some of these special kinds of prairies. And then finally, giving it, again, sort of a glade-like feel is the yellow coneflower. Quite different actually from the gray-headed coneflower, which is in a different genus. This one is a very close relative of the pale purple coneflower, another species in that genus. And so the yellow coneflower, again, common on glades in Missouri, but occurring just occasionally on some of the prairies with that limestone feel. And then at the northern end of the prairie, in an area that's quite a bit different as far as microhabitats in a kind of a moist little swale, is this beautiful large lily called bunch flower. And then finally this summer, while a botanical investigation, a floristic survey was being done in the prairie, a population of Mead's milkweed was discovered. And Mead's milkweed is a federally listed species and is considered one of the rarest prairie plants we have. And so this is a real gem to find on this prairie also. So again, we've been taking a look at these couple prairies that we just dedicated. They're new to the Prairie Foundation. We just dedicated them this past summer. And those are a few of the things that you find on these very high quality prairie remnants, the natural community with a lot of species, some actually rare species, but many of them are very important and significant to have them here just from the standpoint of efforts to protect our very important biodiversity. And so with that, Jerod is going to fill everybody in on some of the management that's been taking place and that on these prairies.
Bruce, can you go ahead and go to the next slide? There you go. So I'll kind of go through just an overview of each prairie and then go through some management items for each. You can see the yellow shaded area on the map. That's the historical, what would have been historically covered in prairie pre-settlement times. To the north and west, you'll see our La Petite Gem Prairie. The highway that splits those two is Highway 13 going from Springfield to Bolivar. Bolivar's the town there you can see on the map. And so Schuette Prairie is just to the east of Highway 13 and would have been pretty square in that historical prairie map right there. This site, unlike the one further to the west, the Ray Letsinger Prairie, was more towards, like Bruce kind of alluded to, was more towards the Ozark, so it would have been more of a woodland interface, lots of glade and woodland habitat mixed in with the scattered prairies you can see on the map here. And so that's what gives it a lot of the differences from the Ray Letsinger prairie, which was largely in a wide open prairie system further to the west. Next one. So this is the outline here. It's just pretty much a square 40-acre tract. When we had the dedication, if you were there, it was on the southwest corner of the prairie, and we had burned the southern half of the prairie at that time from the isolated little tree clump kind of by the S. Everything to the south, that half was burned. And so you can really tell a big difference if you go by there even right now. The burn unit to the unburned unit, just how much those burns stimulate the wildflowers. Also helps thin out some of the woody vegetation on there, as well as, reduces the understory vegetation, makes it better for certain grassland birds, it changes things for all kinds of wildlife. So, the increased floral resources really helps things like pollinators. It also helps the grassland birds throughout the whole phase of their lives. So it helps the baby grassland birds because of the increased pollinators. They're going to have more insects to eat. And then also later in the season, the grassland birds are going to be attracted to those seeds from the increased flower production. So lots of good things that those prescribed burns do other than just producing flowers. So you can see on the map, I've got the treed areas are shaded in green, just a few acres in total. We're going to try to remove those trees over the course of the next couple of years. The southeast corner or the bottom right corner of the map, it's a pretty wet spot on the prairie. So we'll have to take a little bit more care in there. And then also the finger of trees that comes out from the top right corner or the northeast corner of the map. That is along what is called a Prairie Swale. So kind of just a natural depression in the prairie. Historically, it wouldn't have really been a creek. It looks a little bit more like a creek right now due to erosion and tree cover, but eventually we'll clear all those trees out. There is a really nice stand of bunch flower in there, which is another, I think it's a 10. And so it only grows pretty much in wet parts of prairies, prairie swales, and depressions that stay wetter throughout the season. So there is some fescue kind of in the farthest west portion of that draw, and then up to where you can see that green dot. That's a more degraded portion. You can see on the very northwest corner, there's two kind of areas where you can see clear disturbance. The previous owners were a union, and so they used this area, not really knowing the importance of this prairie as training for equipment operation. And so we will eventually reconstruct that with native plants from on site. The abundance of plants on site will really make it quite easy to collect enough seed to reconstruct a few acres right there. We will put a parking lot in where the green dot is, and so that's where everyone will be able to access it. There will be a small gate and a walkthrough for folks to get to access the rest of the site. But yeah, long term, our plans are just going to be to monitor for invasive species. I did find a little bit of Sericea lespedeza there here this year and treated it. There's a little bit of Japanese honeysuckle along fence rows. Removing the trees will help limit the spread of that. And then just prescribed burning, rotating around in a prescribed burn rotation really helps keep the brush out. And it helps keep a lot of those invasives out. Really, it just keeps them from spreading quite as much, especially things like the honeysuckle or other brush species like multiflora rose. So that will be our long-term management plans for Schuette Prairie. The first thing, like I mentioned, is going to be conducting the prescribed burns, treating the fescue, and then starting on the tree removal. So there's a portion you can see, you can probably see on the map. There's much larger trees along that prairie swale that I mentioned, and then there's kind of a cove of a lot smaller trees in there. And those are all really small cedars, anywhere from 6 to 10 feet in height. And so the succession there has not been quite as, I guess, prolonged or hasn't advanced as far as the succession in the southeast corner. And so that'll probably be one of our first priorities. There are still things like the bunch flower and other good prairie plants underneath those cedars and mixed in amongst the cedars. So getting those off immediately will be a high priority, just to save what prairie plants are still in that corner, so that we don't need to reconstruct. If you've got good prairie plants there, we might as well save those while there's still time. That's about it. If anyone's got questions on Schuette Prairie a little bit later on, I'm happy to answer those. We can go to the next one, Bruce. So this is the first burn in a few years at Schuette Prairie. One of the previous workers that worked for the union actually recognized how special this prairie was approximately 20 years ago. It was mostly covered in small cedars, and other brush had encroached. This was probably before the spread of Sericea lespedeza throughout the state, so luckily that hasn't taken hold on the site. But he realized there was a lot of wildflowers out there. He started removing some of the cedar trees and started doing some prescribed burns, mixed in with some haying occasionally. And I think on average, it was something like it would get burned every second or third year, and then it might get hayed in between the burnings. And that's really, what has made it be what it is today. You can see my fire line there. And we never burned the entire prairie at once. I actually had a gentleman call today asking about another prairie site. And so we never do the same management over an entire site in the same year, for a lot of different reasons. It's not always the best thing for those plants at that given time. It's never the best thing for things like grassland birds or pollinators or the herps, so the snakes, the lizards, the frogs, any other amphibians. So if we burned that entire prairie, it's largely surrounded by heavily grazed pastures and hayed areas. And so if you burn that entire site, you're killing all the caterpillars that overwinter in that vegetation, all the beetles, all the other insects that live on that prairie site. So when you're killing all of those animals off of a site in a given season, with the reduction in prairie around that area, La Petite Gem is 6 or 7 miles to the northwest, and that's pretty much the closest prairie site. So you just think of the inability of things like a rare beetle or a certain reptile, or even things like turtles. They're not going to be able to recolonize this site in any reasonable time period, if ever. So it's really important to leave a refuge, and roughly half to 2/3 of the site in a given season we leave as refuge for the wildlife. There's also things, we try to burn from fall through kind of early to late winter sometimes. And so, you think about the migrating raptors that will use our prairies for hunting grounds, different harriers, short-eared owls, we see a lot in winter times. And so they use our prairies and other grassland areas as kind of a pit stop to refuel and hunt for small mammals. And so if this 40-acre site is gone, then, and say we've burned half of La Petite Gem, instead of having 80 acres to hunt on, they may only have, half of La Petite Gem to hunt on. And then where's the next prairie to the south on their migration? So it's really important to leave that refuge when we're doing our burns. Next. Okay, so you'll see here, you can see the Ray Letsinger Prairie here. Our Noah Brown's Prairie is about 7 miles, pretty much directly to the west of this. And then our Carver Prairie is almost 7 miles directly to the west of that. They're all within about a mile north and south of each other. And you'll see the expansive prairie in this area is much, much greater, a lot less area covered in trees historically. The trees in this part of the state would have been confined more to the river valleys, creek bottoms, things like that. And this one's actually a little bit more to the center of the historical prairie. So quite a bit more further away from the edges of what would have been historically woodland or woodland boundary. Go ahead to the next one. Okay, so this one's a little bit bigger than Schuette Prairie, was 40 acres. This one's 67, 68 acres. Also has a little bit more woody encroachment, and the management was just slightly different over the years. It's hard for us to know exactly what's went on both prairies. We burned from about where the words Ray Letsinger are. We burned most of the area to the south of that, and so we'll burn what's north of that, and on also to the east of the wooded corridor that cuts the prairie into there. And we're going to start on the woody tree removal, especially along that creek corridor, opening that area up. There's a pond right in the center. You can kind of see it on the map. It's green. We will leave the pond there. It serves as a nice source for a lot of the herps that are on site. There's several species of frogs that we've seen on site, various turtles, things like that, utilize that creek through there. But removing the trees will be important, just as far as opening up the prairie. And then also, it reduces various small mammal predators for grassland bird nesting. It just makes it historically what that prairie once was, which was up on a high kind of prairie plain. And this prairie here does have a little bit more exotics just in this part of the state. There's quite a few invasive species coming off of the highways. The surrounding landscape is much different from the other one there as well. There's more Johnson grass and things like that in this area, and that those things along the roadsides, you don't think about them a whole lot, but they really impact our prairies, especially our smaller sites. You think about, a wooded tree line on the neighbor, that's a really big seed source for brushy species to spread throughout our prairies. So surrounding land use really does impact our prairies quite a bit more than you would think that it would. And then, so there is, if you want to go visit this site, there is a small pull off, and this is where we access during the dedication, where the green dot is. Eventually that entire woodlot to the north will be removed. There's around 16 acres, I think, in total of brushy encroachment and trees on this map here. So eventually all of that's going to be gone, with the exception of maybe a willow or two that are in the pond/wetland. And it is kind of more of a wetland. It really backs up that into that creek. The pond bank isn't extremely steep or tall, and it seems to really dry up in the summertime, so it doesn't seem like it's going to hold any fish. So it really will be good for various amphibians and reptile species that will use it. We've also had word that there are some shorebirds that use it from time to time, and I know waterfowl use it as well in the winter. So go ahead, Bruce. So this was our first burn on the Ray Letsinger prairie, and you can see this is in that smaller chunk of prairie that was to the east of the wooded draw. We've got some volunteers here, and the water unit. We're starting our backing fire, and we've already lit along in fact, this actually kind of looks like the head fire, but we've got the fire lit along the fence there. And we will have, at this point, we've already lit back towards the road on the south side, and then we're lighting along this fire line, spraying it out, and using the fire swatters to put out any residual fire behind the water unit. But this is kind of our typical setup. We rely heavily on volunteers, so I'm really the only field staff. Bruce and several other of the board members and other MPF members help out. This is Scott here. He's helping kind of in the background. You can see on the fire line, he's one of our big helpers from the Joplin Master Naturalist group, and him and his dad help out a lot. But without volunteers, we wouldn't get hardly any of these prescribed burns done. I think Bruce and I have done one, just the two of us, but we really need 6, even 8 people on a lot of these burns to safely get these burns completed and to do them in a timely manner. As I mentioned, we like to start maybe late October if we can. A lot of times weather doesn't allow us to get started till even late November. And then we're really trying to get them done by the end of January if possible, and then some push over into February. All the data really shows you that the later you burn into the spring, like pushing them into March, you're really hurting a lot of those early wildflower species like prairie violets, even things like the Indian paintbrush, shooting star. A lot of those early blooming wildflower species really are drastically reduced in a given season. Now, I don't know if they're actually killed out, but they're not going to flower that following year because you kind of burned off what they were trying to do under the soil surface by burning so late. And historically, Mother Nature and Native Americans would have burned, you know, during the fall. A lot of times, you know, Bruce has mentioned, they kind of refer to that late fall time period, November, early December, as the Indian summer. You know, you get those warm, windy days, and that's historically when Native Americans would have lit off a lot of their prairies. It's going to prompt us much sooner green up. Even some things could potentially green up a little bit in the fall, but you know, it would attract to those game species historically. And so that's what we're trying to replicate, is what those plants are adapted to. And that's going to be those fall and early winter burns. Go ahead. That's the last one, I believe. So,
Yep.
so yeah, that's essentially what we're going to focus on. Is on all of our prairies, invasive species management is huge. You know, you can't let Sericea lespedeza take over areas and get established. Tree encroachment and any established tree lots were going to be removed in the next couple of years on both those sites. And then over time, you know, collect seed from on site and reconstruct those degraded areas. Through time, things will change slightly across each prairie, just with changing in management. So the Ray Letsinger Prairie has a long 5-6 decades long history of annual haying. You know, they might hay it from July through September. And so, but that annual haying is going to be a much different management regime than mixing in prescribed burning. And so the prescribed burning is really going to favor a lot of the flowering species as opposed to the grass. And so we will see a really big change in the composition and just the overall look of those prairies over time with the change in management. But that's all I've got. If there's questions or comments.
Thank you, Bruce and Jerod. That was wonderful. This is Carol David back on to send some questions or for me. I will relate your questions that you've posed in the Q&A to Bruce and Jerod. The first question we have is, for Jerod, what process do you use to remove that large stand of trees? And by that large stand of trees, I think Judith is probably referring to the Ray Letsinger property.
So the Ray Letsinger property is slightly different than the Schuette Prairie. A lot of the trees on the north end are going to be in a low wet area, and then the trees on the southeast corner are a much higher area. So we can go in just about any time and get the trees on the southeast corner with like a skid steer, it's called a tree shear. There's a few other pieces of equipment, but essentially you'll clip those trees at ground level. We can apply a little bit of herbicide to that stump, and then we can stack those trees in piles on some of the most degraded parts of that. So definitely we're not going to stack brush out in the prairie and burn and have a dead spot. We're going to stack it in an area where there's solid honeysuckle or something. And there's quite a bit down in that corner. So essentially you're burning up that vegetation, and then over time with rains and things like that, you've removed the wooded vegetation. Then we're going to know what we have. There's quite a bit of Sericea lespedeza down in that corner. We're probably going to have to fight it for a few years, and then we'll collect the seed from the prairie and scatter it on that area that's now opened up. Just being in there, and from my experience, there's not going to be a lot of natives left in that corner. On the north side, we're going to have to be a lot more careful with equipment because it does stay wet. But we can go in by hand. We can cut a lot of those trees out of there. Maybe use a smaller tractor to come in and pull some of those trees out of there, or hand pile some of that brush back in there. Those trees on the north end aren't quite as tightly packed, and so there are still some native grasses and things intermixed with that. And so we'll probably be a little more careful on the north end. The trees throughout the draw, there's a lot of maples, mostly all undesirable tree species. If you ever wanted a tree in a prairie, there's not one there that we would want. So we will probably girdle a lot of those trees. There's some pin oaks and some really large shingle oaks in that draw. They're so big, just dealing with them once they're on the ground is a lot of work, takes really big equipment. And so some of those biggest trees in that north-south wooded draw, my plan would be to girdle those trees, leave them standing, they'll drop limbs over the years that will burn up in fires. We may eventually burn some of them up as we do prescribed burning. If they hollow out, bats could use them. Woodpeckers will certainly use them. We did some similar projects, and it was amazing. Almost 50% of the trees we left standing were being used by woodpeckers. So, as you take away habitat, you're creating habitat for other things.
Thank you. There's a question here. Why get rid of trees? Aren't trees just as good for nature as prairie? And I think for those who may be less familiar with prairie, this may seem strange. Why are we getting rid of trees? And Bruce and Jerod may wish to chime in, but if you look at the habitats in Missouri, we have forest, we have woodland, we have savanna, we have glade, wetlands, prairie. We once had 15 million acres of prairie in our state, and it's been reduced to 51,000 scattered acres, less than 0.5%. And so much of it was lost due to land conversion, but also to tree invasion. So this is about, we want to sustain as many different kinds of habitats and species as we can. And so if we allowed woody invasion of prairies to continue, we would have less biodiversity, because the plants that you see on the screen in front of you would not be there in the shade of trees. But Jerod and Bruce may wish to chime in more on that question.
The issues I have with the trees, even on the surrounding edges of prairies, I mentioned a little bit, but you're introducing that seed source. And so you'll go out on a prairie and you'll see a lot of persimmon or a lot of cherry sprouts. And so fire doesn't kill those. And so if I've got to go in and spray those, it's almost impossible to spray only that plant. So I'm very careful, but every time I'm going in and I'm spraying these scattered, trees that aren't supposed to be out in the prairie. And like you say, if you let them grow up, they're going to shade out these native sun-loving plants. I am probably killing some plants here and there. And over time, you're losing diversity because of that, because of the encroachment. It creates a spot out in the prairie for birds to land and potentially spread invasive seeds like Sericea lespedeza from next door. Not that we don't want birds landing in the prairie, but it's just another issue. So other things that are really detrimental are ground nesting predators or ground predators to ground nesting birds. And so the more encroachment you have, even on a really, really large prairie, if you've got little dissections here and there from wooded draws, it allows access to those nests of the birds by the predators. And so the predators aren't going to venture out as far from a fence row or from a wooded corridor. So the more we can reduce that, the better off our grassland birds are going to do. And grassland birds, are really in huge decline. So just the more we can do, trees all around are just not good for prairies. They weren't historically in prairies and don't belong there now. So.
Yeah, and I would say that basically, if our goal is to protect the native biodiversity of a site, and even more broadly, biodiversity of Missouri, we need to be keeping all the different natural communities, because each natural community has its own group of plants and animals that needs those conditions of that community, or else they will disappear. And so parts of the state were forested or were woodland. And of course, in those areas, you wouldn't want to get rid of all the trees. Trees are part of those systems. But we know from pre-settlement survey notes that 15 million acres of Missouri was open prairie that was essentially treeless, maybe a tree, especially an oak tree every now and then, but was essentially treeless. These ecosystems depend on being open and sunny for these plants that are there and the animals that depend on them. And if we let trees take over these sites, we would totally lose this prairie ecosystem, and the great amount of biodiversity that it supports would simply disappear by allowing trees to come up in some place where historically they never were.
Thank you. Speaking of Serratia lespedeza, it's a question about how do you manage it? Deborah is saying she's noticed it 2 years ago in her small prairie.
So you really have to treat it annually. It's once it's established, especially if you have big kind of swaths of it, the size of a vehicle or larger, then it's a pretty established patch. If you've got a couple isolated spots of it here and there, that's very common. So any triclopyr based product is kind of the recommended product. We like to use Remedy. You can use Pasture Guard. There's a lot of different brands out there, but triclopyr is going to be the active ingredient. And anytime June through kind of early September, you want to catch it before it goes to seed. Produces a lot of seed, and the seed stays viable for a long time. So once you start getting those really large patches, you're going to have to just broadcast them. If it's really dense over a large area, we incorporate some mowing or haying after we treat it with chemical, because you just know there's so many plants there. There's no way you're possibly going to get every plant sprayed, and you don't want any more seed entering the seed bank. So mowing will keep it from going to seed. If you're not comfortable with, chemicals and things like that, you could just go mow it until you can find somebody to come spray it for you. There's contractors and things like that out there, but definitely herbicide's the only way to kill it out efficiently.
Thank you. Question from Richard. At the Schuette site, are the adjoining areas considered remnant prairies also, despite not being owned by the Missouri Prairie Foundation?
No, the areas around the prairie that are owned by individuals, none of those are remnant prairie.
Richard, I will add though that in other instances, sometimes there's land that's next to properties that we own, and we do get to know our neighbors as much as we can, especially obviously if they live there. And sometimes they have prairie, or sometimes we can work together to help them manage. Perhaps Jerod might want to speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, we've got a neighbor up next to our Golden Prairie we're working with to help better manage their site. And there's several of our prairies where we have other prairie sites within a couple of miles. And like Carol mentioned, we always try to reach out. And if we notice that there's things that can be done to protect certain species, or maybe it's haying at a different time than they're currently haying, things like that. We've helped some landowners burn in the past. And one thing I always recommend for landowners is reaching out to MDC, private lands conservationists, for cost shares. So we definitely do help out, but yeah, nothing around the Schuette Prairie currently. The landowner to the south and west mentioned having maybe some remnant plants, but largely there is no remnant, what you would consider remnant prairie around there.
Thank you. I started to answer this question by typing, but I hit answer live instead of type the question. But Carol has a question. Are there any prairies in the glaciated region of Missouri? And yes, Carol, there are. And the glaciated region is basically the part of Missouri north of the Missouri River. This area was once very heavily covered with prairie, but because it's so good for agriculture, so much of it was converted to agriculture, and there's very little left. But there are some very nice examples of prairies owned by a number of different conservation landowners. The Missouri Prairie Foundation owns a small property called Runge Prairie, which is remnant, but it's also, there was also some planting done there as well. Perhaps Bruce would like to address that some more.
Yeah, well, just very quickly, as Carol mentioned, there were millions of acres of prairie in northern Missouri originally, but because of its suitability for cropping in that, there is very little left, but there are a few nice little remnants. So there are a few, but there's not too many to work with because of just the extreme rarity there, and hopefully the chance of getting fewer in conservation ownership, but there's some that are not. And so hopefully, there could still be the opportunity for adding a few more remnants in northern Missouri. But while there are a few, they are just very, very scarce.
Thank you, Bruce. And there's a question from Deborah on how do you spell the recommended control? I think she might be referring to when you were talking about controlling Sericea. Jerod, could you just repeat what you said and I'll type it for her.
Yeah, so it's triclopyr, TRICLOPYR. And like I said, that's the actual chemical name. If you just type that in on Google, it's going to bring you up a dozen different brand names. Remedy or Pasture Guard are two that we use. There's several others out there, you know, Orchlands or Tractor Supply. They're all going to have, I think one's called Clear Pasture, just a generic name, but you want that active ingredient to say triclopyr.
Thank you. And I'll type that into the chat later. Karen asks, after a big slash burn or a tree trunk burn, for how long will the soil underneath be unacceptable to germinating seed?
So one thing, there was a couple of surveys that I was pointed to, and one thing that I've noticed, it's not as often the extreme heating that impacts the plant growth as it is the pile of debris that you leave. So you think of after, you know, that I was always told that you basically cook the soil or turn it to a brick or whatever underneath. But one thing we found is if you take and blow all that ash off, like on a really windy day, or if it's in an area that gets water flow, things like that, if you remove that, you know, 3-4 inches of ash that you've got laying there and expose the bare soil, you're going to get plants to establish a lot quicker. So we've been doing some of that on some of our reconstruction sites. I'll go in with my backpack blower on a windy day and, you know, blow the ash, and then it distributes kind of evenly, doesn't harm anything downwind of it. But then it allows those native plants, you know, I'll have wild rye come up the next year in those sites. You may not have things like the rattlesnake master popping up in it right away, but at least you're getting some native plants to establish in those areas right away instead of having a dead spot for what seems like 10 years.
Thank you. There's a question, are most of the Missouri Prairie Foundation properties fenced? I think it's a mix, isn't it? Perhaps.
Yeah, it is. And it's a lot of times just determined on how we get them. You know, the Ray Letsinger Prairie is unfenced on 2 sides. I've talked to some of the locals, you know, and they've never really had issues. We had an issue this year of someone driving off the road onto it, and I don't know if they were coming to visit the prairie or what, but made some small ruts in a couple of spots. If we have issues like that, we will certainly fence it to protect the prairie. You know, from a management standpoint, fences attract brush and make it harder to mow fire lines and things like that. So fewer fences, the better for me. But you know, our Carver Prairie is not fenced along the road, but a lot of ours are, and that's the way we purchase them. From a prairie management standpoint, there's not a real need for us to have fences. It's kind of just a mix.
Thanks. And another question is, what methods do we use to keep fence rows clear? And does burning take care of some of this maintenance? And this is a question from Dana. And as Jerod just mentioned, if we don't need a fence, we don't like to have one, and that's probably one of the best ways to keep the air, you know, to prevent the tree rows and the fences. But Jerod, can you answer that about keeping fence rows clear?
Yeah. So one thing that I always have done, you know, even back when I worked for MDC, is burning up to the roadside. Instead of mowing your fire line on the inside of that fence and never exposing that fence row to any type of fire to set back that succession, you're just allowing it to grow up. And then you have to use mechanical removal, chainsaws, chemical, things like that. I will go through and spray a lot of our fence rows, like certainly the Schuette Prairie fence row needs some herbicide at this point. It's thick enough that fire doesn't carry through it very well in most spots. And so, you know, just go through and spray, you know, along the top of that fence row, and basically you're just going to kill whatever you get the herbicide on. So be careful not to get in the prairie. And then once you can carry a fire through that consistently, it seems like the fire does a really good job of keeping that fence row clean at that point.
Thank you. Pamela says, I have 6 acres and would like more wildflowers and that she has invasive she has invasive honeysuckle, what are the things I need to do first? I think she means, what do I need to do to prepare for having more wildflowers?
Yeah, I mean, I would have a private lands conservationist come out and look at your site if you haven't already done that. So it really depends on what your existing plants are on site. You know, if it's tall fescue, you've got some work to do. If it's mostly native grasses, maybe just prescribed burning might bring back a lot of wildflowers if you think it's maybe a remnant situation. You know, you need to kill the honeysuckle out. That's best done in the fall with just glyphosate. You can spray it after a frost. The honeysuckle stays green well into December most years. And at that point, all the native species for the most part have gone dormant. But yeah, you really kind of have to assess the vegetation on site before you can make any plans to get more wildflowers, because the seed's really expensive. You can't just go out onto a site and spread a bunch of seed and expect it to do well. The site has to be ready for that seed.
Thank you. And I'm just putting into the chat a link to a resource that Jerod put together. It's a table of common invasive plants and grasslands and their recommended treatments. So there you'll find common and scientific names of plants, of invasive plants, the recommended herbicide, the chemical name and the trade name, treatment method. So it's a really good resource. And there's another question: are there any issues with neighboring land and pesticides? And just to clarify, when we talk about herbicides, we mean just that, chemicals that are designed to kill plants. We don't use pesticide can be a general term that encompasses many different kinds of chemicals to control insects or plants or fungi, or it can be used to refer to chemicals used to kill insects. So we don't use insecticides. I don't know that we've had any issues with neighboring use of insecticides. Jerod or Bruce, did you want to comment on that?
You know, as far as insecticides go, it's kind of one of those things that's scary to think about, because somebody could go out and spray our entire prairie with an insecticide and we wouldn't necessarily know about it. So herbicides are going to be much more evident. You'll see the dead vegetation. But if we've got a neighboring farmer that was spraying on a day that we were upwind of him or downwind of him when he was spraying a harmful insecticide, you know, that could very easily drift across our prairie sites and kill a lot of the pollinators. And, you know, unless I just went out there and saw dead butterflies laying all over the vegetation, you're not going to know what happened. And so, yeah, it's kind of, you know, a little bit alarming to think about it. But, you know, that being said, most of our prairies have a good diversity of pollinators, especially compared to non-native vegetation. And so you hope they're resilient to something if something like that would happen.
Yeah, I don't recall us ever having an issue with that having happened.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't think that, and of course, you know, in most cases, if someone is using it on their land, I mean, you know, they generally are going to be careful with it for a number of reasons. One, to be a good neighbor, and also because it's, you know, it's costly. And so they're going to want to use, you know, whatever chemical they're using very judiciously. So yeah, luckily, you know, fortunately, we haven't had an issue yet, but, you know, it is something to be mindful of. I think we've got one last question from Michael. Can you explain the haying process? And I'm not exactly sure. We don't hay generally, but so maybe Jerod, you could explain when and why people who do hay, you know, who have prairies and they do hay them, when they do that and why, and then, you know, our use of haying when we do hay.
Yeah, so like for the Ray Letsinger prairie, historically had been hayed for decades, and presumably for decades prior to the most recent landowner. Most of the good prairies left in the state that aren't protected by a agency like ourselves or MDC or any other conservation organization, most of those good prairies are hayed prairies and are currently being hayed once a year. pretty much the vegetation only produces once a year. It's not like fescue where it creates an abundance of vegetation, potentially a couple of times. Most people hay right around July 1st, within a couple of weeks, either way of that. There's a lot of landowners, if you talk to them and they've had prairie is one of those things where you could hay it July 1st. And if you're busy, you could hay it September 1st and you still got decent hay. It's not going to nutrient test out as good as the hay was on July 1st, when you're cutting it that late, but it provides nutrition for the cattle. So a lot of people that owned prairie over the years and still own prairie really, really valued those prairies for that reason. And that's why they're still in prairie today. Prairie does a good, or haying does a good job of keeping the brush off the prairie. So like we mentioned, all these tree species surrounding the prairies and stuff like that, you're cutting those sprouts off every year, and so they're never expanding. Same with like Sericea lespedeza. It doesn't allow the Sericea lespedeza to seed out every year. So it keeps a couple of those things out. And, we're thankful that those folks hay it rather than row crop it, because then the prairie wouldn't be left. We use it a little bit differently, when you're haying it, you're taking off all of that vegetation. So it's really bad for pollinators. It's not great for soil health. At that point, you're taking out all the habitat for grassland birds. So there's, biologically, there's not a great reason to hay it when you can have what you see in the picture here. But, I work with some of our surrounding landowners, neighbors and things like that to hay our fire lines a lot of times, because it makes less for me to have to mow. And then instead of having all of what you see in the picture there laying on the ground after mowing, that they're taking, a 40-foot wide swath of that out. And so I'm just coming back in and cleaning up a little bit of regrowth, like 6 inches, and essentially we're left with what your suburban lawn might look like to burn off of, instead of a lot of dead material kind of laying on the surface. And then we've utilized it a little bit, as I mentioned earlier, to help control Sericea infestations on a couple of CRP sites that weren't remnants. So, we may have, like on our Denison Prairie, we hayed 40 acres one year, just to try to get ahead of some Sericea invasions. And we had really good results with it. We sprayed before we hayed it, and then what grows back was essentially the Sericea. And so you can go along and find those Sericea clumps that you missed the first spraying after you hayed it. So we use it to our advantage. We may use it a little bit more in the future. It's a disturbance. Like I mentioned, it has some benefits. It doesn't benefit the floral response that burning does, not even close. So, but it has its purposes.
Thank you, Jerod. Well, I don't see any other questions. So thank you very much, Bruce and Jerod, and thanks everyone else for joining us. I did want to remind everyone that, as Bruce said, we have another Prairie Dedication coming up this Friday. It's going to be a virtual dedication via video. That's during our annual dinner, which will be virtual this year. It's free to attend and register for. You can go to our website and register. We'll provide a link in the email that we send you tomorrow. Also, you can help support the work that we do by becoming a member. If you're not a member now, you can check out our online silent auction that's open now through noon on Saturday. We've got lots of wonderful items. We also are going to have an in-person dedication, our last one of the year, at our Lordy Marker Prairie on October 2nd. That's south of Sedalia, and you can watch our e-news and social media for information about that. And I will, as I mentioned, Brooke will send an email out to all of you tomorrow with some of the things I shared in the chat today, and resources, that is, and there'll be a link to a recording of today's presentation. So thank you all very much for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thanks, Carol.
Thanks. Bye.